Hello there, and welcome to Sleep Orion. Tonight, let's drift into one of history's most extraordinary discoveries, a moment when time itself seemed to fold back, revealing secrets that had been hidden for 2,000 years. A story that began not with scholars or archaeologists, but with a young shepherd and his wandering flock in the rocky hills above the Dead Sea. Maybe you've had a long day. Maybe your thoughts are still racing from the hours behind you. That's all right. You don't need to do anything now but rest. Let your breathing slow and steady itself. Feel the weight of your body settling into comfort as we journey together into the Judean Desert, to a discovery that would reshape our understanding of ancient faith, of preservation, of the voices from centuries past whispering through fragments of parchment and leather. Tonight we explore the Dead Sea Scrolls, not just as archaeological artifacts, but as a human story, one of accident and intention, of loss and recovery, of desert caves that kept their secrets through empires rising and falling, through centuries of silence, until one afternoon in 1947 when everything changed. The Judean Desert is a landscape that seems to exist outside of ordinary time. It stretches eastward from Jerusalem, a dramatic plunge from the ancient city's hills down to the lowest point on Earth, the shores of the Dead Sea, more than 1,300 feet below sea level. The air here shimmers with heat. The limestone cliffs glow white and gold under an unrelenting sun. Rocky outcrops jut from hillsides where virtually nothing grows. It is a place of extremes, of silence, of stone and salt and endless sky. For thousands of years, people have come to this wilderness seeking something. David, fleeing from King Saul's jealous rage, found refuge in these caves. John the Baptist preached somewhere in this desolation, preparing the way. Jesus faced temptation in these wastes. The very barrenness of the place seems to invite contemplation, to strip away everything but what matters most. And beneath the surface, hidden in crevices and caverns, the desert had been keeping secrets, waiting for someone to stumble upon them. That someone turned out to be a young Bedouin shepherd named Muhammad Edhdib, though the exact details of that first discovery remain wrapped in the uncertainty that often surrounds momentous events. The most commonly told version places the time somewhere between November 1946 and early 1947. Muhammad belonged to the Ta'amireh tribe, a group of Bedouin shepherds who had roamed these hills for generations, knowing every path and spring, every cave and cliff face. On this particular day, Muhammad was tending his flock of goats and sheep in the rocky hills near a place called Qumran, about a mile from the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea. The animals scattered across the hillside in their endless search for the sparse vegetation that managed to survive in this harsh environment. As Muhammad counted his charges, he realized one animal had wandered off. In the fading afternoon light, he set off to find it, climbing higher into the limestone cliffs that rose above the desert floor. The cliffs here are honeycombed with caves, natural formations carved by water and wind over millions of years. Some are shallow depressions barely worthy of the name. Others tunnel deep into the rock, cool refuges from the searing heat. As Muhammad scrambled across the rocky face, he noticed one particular cave opening, a dark vertical cleft in the cliff face, perhaps 10 feet above where he stood. Curious, and perhaps hoping his lost animal had taken shelter there, Muhammad picked up a stone and tossed it into the darkness. Instead of the bleat of a startled goat or the silence of an empty space, he heard something completely unexpected. The sharp crack of breaking pottery echoed from within the cave, a sound that seemed to hang in the desert air, a sound that would echo, in its way, around the world. Muhammad climbed up to the cave entrance and peered inside. As his eyes adjusted to the dim interior, he could make out a collection of large clay jars arranged along the walls. They were tall vessels, perhaps 2 feet high, shaped by hands that had turned to dust millennia ago. Some had broken over the centuries, their fragments scattered across the cave floor. Others stood intact, their lids still in place, sealed against time and the elements. With mounting excitement, Muhammad examined the jars. Were they filled with gold? With treasure hidden by ancient bandits? He lifted one lid and reached inside. His fingers touched not metal or gems, but something else entirely. Scrolls. Old scrolls, wrapped in linen that crumbled at his touch, darkened with age until they were almost black. The leather or parchment felt brittle, fragile, as though it might disintegrate if handled roughly. To Muhammad, standing in that cave as the daylight faded outside, these scrolls had no obvious value. They weren't treasure in any conventional sense. They were just old writings, indecipherable marks on ancient materials. But something about the jars, about the care with which these scrolls had been stored, suggested they had mattered to someone once. Perhaps, he thought, they might matter to someone now. Muhammad didn't remove all the scrolls that day. The light was fading, and he had his flock to tend. But he took a few of the scrolls with him, wrapped in their disintegrating linen, and made his way back down the cliff as darkness settled over the desert. He shared his find with his companions, other Bedouin shepherds including his cousin Jameh Muhammad and a man named Khalil Musa. Together, they returned to the cave in the days that followed, retrieving more scrolls, examining them in the harsh desert light, wondering what to do with their discovery. The scrolls themselves were remarkable objects, even to eyes that couldn't read the ancient Hebrew script covering them. Some were large, intact rolls of leather or parchment, the sheets sewn together to form continuous documents that could be unrolled to reveal column after column of careful writing. Others were smaller, more fragmentary. The writing itself was beautiful, executed by skilled scribes in various hands, some elegant and formal, others more cursive and flowing. The ink, made from carbon black, had survived the centuries remarkably well on most documents, though some scrolls were so darkened with age that the text was barely visible. The Bedouin kept the scrolls for some time, hanging them from a tent pole while they debated what to do with them. They knew instinctively that old writings might have value, but to whom? And how much? The scrolls were fragile, requiring careful handling. During this period of uncertainty, one of the scrolls, later identified as the community rule, split in two, though fortunately both halves would eventually be preserved. Finally, the Bedouin decided to take their find to Bethlehem, a few miles away, where they knew there were dealers in antiquities. Their first stop was to a Muslim dealer named Ibrahim Dija. They spread the scrolls before him, hoping for a favorable response. But Ija, after examining the ancient Hebrew writing, warned them that these might have been stolen from a synagogue. If so, possessing them could bring trouble. He returned the scrolls, claiming they were worthless. Undaunted, the Bedouin tried another approach. They took the scrolls to a market in Bethlehem, hoping to find a buyer there. A Syrian Christian showed interest and suggested they speak with Khalil Iskander Shahin, known locally as Kando. Kando was a cobbler by trade, but like many residents of Bethlehem, he supplemented his income by dealing in antiquities. The Bedouin and Kando returned to the cave together, and Kando immediately recognized that these scrolls were genuinely ancient and potentially valuable. A complicated series of transactions followed. The Bedouin left one scroll with Kando for safekeeping. 3 others were sold to another dealer for 7 Jordanian pounds, approximately $28 American at the time, though inflation would make that equivalent to several $100s in modern currency. It was a pittance for documents of such historical significance, but the Bedouin had no way of knowing the true value of what they had found. To them, any money for old scrolls was a fortunate outcome. The scrolls continued to change hands through the Bethlehem Antiquities network. Eventually, 4 of them came into the possession of Metropolitan Archbishop Samuel, also known as Mar Athanasius Yesu Samuel, the head of the Syrian Orthodox monastery of St. Mark in Jerusalem. These 4 scrolls were the Great Isaiah Scroll, the Community Rule, the Habakkuk Commentary, and what would later be identified as the Genesis Apocryphon, though this last scroll was so tightly rolled and fragile that it couldn't be opened immediately. The other 3 scrolls took a different path. They were purchased by Eliezer Leeper Sukenik, a professor of archaeology at Hebrew University in Jerusalem. Sukenik's involvement in the story adds another layer of drama to an already extraordinary tale. He first learned about the scrolls from an Armenian antiquities dealer in November 1947, a time of tremendous tension in Palestine. The United Nations had just voted to partition Palestine into Jewish and Arab states, and violence between the communities was escalating. Despite the danger, Sukenik agreed to meet the Armenian dealer at the border between the Jewish and Arab sectors of Jerusalem, then divided by British military checkpoints. The dealer held up a fragment of leather through the barbed wire fence, and Sukenik peered at the ancient Hebrew script. His heart quickened. He recognized the writing style, the letter forms, the language. This was something extraordinary, something very old. Sukenik arranged to travel to Bethlehem, crossing through hostile territory to meet with the dealer who had the scrolls. His diary entry from that day captures his overwhelming emotion as he first unwrapped and examined these ancient manuscripts. His hands shook, he wrote, as he realized he was looking at Hebrew texts that hadn't been read in over 2,000 years. The language reminded him of the Psalms, beautiful biblical Hebrew, but the texts themselves were unknown to him. He felt, he wrote, as though destiny had chosen him to be among the first in 2 millennia to gaze upon these scrolls. Sukenik eventually acquired 3 scrolls, the War Scroll, describing an apocalyptic final battle between the Sons of Light and the Sons of Darkness, the Thanksgiving Hymns, or Hodiot, a collection of prayers and psalms, and a second, more fragmentary copy of the Book of Isaiah. He worked quickly to photograph and study them, even as the political situation in Palestine deteriorated toward full-scale war. Meanwhile, Archbishop Samuel had his 4 scrolls, but he wasn't certain of their value or authenticity. He sought expert opinion, taking them to various scholars. One of the people he contacted was John C. Trevor, a biblical scholar and fellow of the American Schools of Oriental Research in Jerusalem. In February 1948, Trevor examined the scrolls and immediately recognized their significance. Trevor carefully photographed the scrolls in both black and white and color, creating what would prove to be an invaluable record. His photographs captured the scrolls in far better condition than they would later be, as the simple act of handling and exposure to light and air began to take its toll on documents that had been sealed away for 2,000 years. Trevor compared the script on the Isaiah scroll to the Nash Papyrus, then the oldest known biblical manuscript, and found striking similarities. He realized these scrolls were genuinely ancient, perhaps even older than the Nash Papyrus, which dated to the 2nd century BCE. On April 11, 1948, Miller Burroughs, the director of the American Schools of Oriental Research, made a public announcement about the discovery of the scrolls. The news created immediate international interest. Here were biblical manuscripts, copies of books of the Hebrew Bible, that were 1,000 years older than any previously known texts. Scholars around the world recognized the potential significance. These scrolls could shed light on how the biblical text had been transmitted through the centuries. They might resolve long-standing questions about the accuracy of later manuscripts. They could provide insight into Jewish religious life and thought during the crucial period when both Christianity and Rabbinic Judaism were taking shape. But the announcement also came at a time of chaos in Palestine. The British Mandate was ending. War between Jews and Arabs had begun. In May 1948, the State of Israel was declared, and the surrounding Arab nations invaded. Jerusalem itself was divided, with fierce fighting for control of the city. The Rockefeller Museum, where many of the scrolls were housed, was in East Jerusalem, which came under Jordanian control. Archbishop Samuel's scrolls were smuggled out of the country to the United States for safekeeping. Even as war raged, the scramble to find more scrolls began. The original cave, later designated as Cave 1, was relocated by archaeologists in early 1949. Captain Philippe Lipens, a Belgian United Nations observer, and Captain Akash Elzebn of the Arab Legion found the cave on January 28, 1949. A systematic excavation was organized, led by Gerald Lancaster Harding, the British director of the Jordanian Department of Antiquities, and Father Roland de Vos, director of the École Biblique Archéologique Française in East Jerusalem. The archaeological excavation of Cave 1 confirmed what the Bedouin had reported. The cave contained fragments of additional scrolls, pieces of the linen wrappings that had protected them, numerous pottery jars, and other artifacts. The archaeologists could piece together what had happened here, though many questions remained. Someone, or some group, had carefully copied or collected these texts, placed them in pottery jars, and hidden them in this remote cave. But who? And when? And most intriguingly, why? The writing style and script provided some clues. Paleographers, scholars who study ancient handwriting, could date the scripts to various periods between roughly 200 BCE and 70 CE, with most texts falling into the last 2 centuries BCE and the 1st century CE. This was the late Second Temple period, a time of tremendous religious and political ferment in Judea. It was the age of the Maccabees, of Roman conquest, of Jewish sectarian movements, of apocalyptic expectation. And it was, of course, the time of Jesus and the early Christian church, though none of the scrolls make any direct reference to Christian figures or events. The pottery jars themselves could be dated by their style to the 1st century CE. Radiocarbon dating of the linen wrappings, one of the first archaeological uses of this relatively new technique, gave dates consistent with the paleographic evidence. Everything pointed to these scrolls having been placed in the cave sometime around the middle of the 1st century CE, perhaps during the Jewish revolt against Rome that began in 66 CE and ended with the destruction of the Jerusalem Temple in 70 CE. The content of the 7 scrolls from Cave 1 was astonishing. The Great Isaiah Scroll, a beautifully preserved manuscript measuring over 24 feet long, contained the entire book of Isaiah from the Hebrew Bible. Comparing it to later medieval manuscripts revealed how remarkably stable the text had been through more than 1,000 years of copying. There were differences, small variations in spelling and occasional word choices, but the text was recognizably the same. This was powerful evidence for the care and accuracy with which Jewish scribes had transmitted the sacred texts through the generations. But the non-biblical scrolls were equally fascinating. The community rule described the regulations of a Jewish religious community, detailing how members should live, how they should study, how disputes should be resolved, how new members should be initiated. The text spoke of a dualistic worldview, of sons of light and sons of darkness, of a coming final battle between good and evil. The thanksgiving hymns were prayers of profound religious feeling, speaking of human sinfulness and divine grace, of the smallness of humanity before the greatness of God, yet also of God's tender care for those who sought to follow his ways. The Habakkuk commentary took a different approach. It quoted passages from the biblical book of Habakkuk and then provided interpretations that applied those ancient prophecies to the author's own time. The commentary spoke of a figure called the Teacher of Righteousness, a leader of the community who had been persecuted by a wicked priest. It described conflict between the community and the religious authorities in Jerusalem. It spoke of the end of days, of coming judgment, of vindication for the faithful. These texts opened a window into a Jewish religious movement that had been previously unknown. Here was a group that had separated itself from the mainstream of Jewish society, that had developed its own interpretations of Scripture, its own calendar of festivals, its own understanding of purity and holiness. They saw themselves as the true Israel, the faithful remnant keeping the covenant while the rest of the nation had gone astray. They were preparing for the end times, studying the Scriptures to understand the signs of the approaching final days. As word of these remarkable finds spread, both archaeologists and Bedouin treasure hunters intensified their search of the area around Qumran. Over the next several years, 10 more caves containing scroll fragments would be discovered, bringing the total to 11. The Bedouin, who knew the terrain intimately and could search more rapidly than the archaeological teams, found most of the caves. They became skilled at locating the telltale signs, the slight variations in rock color or texture that might indicate a cave opening, the patterns of animal trails that might lead to a cave entrance. Cave 2 was discovered in February 1952, yielding about 300 fragments from 33 different manuscripts. These included portions of biblical books like Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Jeremiah, and Psalms, as well as non-biblical works like Jubilees and the Wisdom of Sirach. The fragments were smaller and more deteriorated than those from Cave 1, but they expanded the library of texts available for study. Cave 3, found in March 1952, produced one of the most unusual and enigmatic of all the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Copper Scroll. Unlike all the other scrolls, which were written on parchment or papyrus, this text was engraved on thin sheets of copper that had oxidized green with age. The scroll described the locations of buried treasure, listing 64 hiding places throughout Judea where gold and silver had supposedly been concealed. The quantities mentioned were enormous, tons of precious metal, far more than any single community could have possessed. Was this a genuine treasure list? A literary work? A coded document? Scholars still debate its meaning and authenticity. But the most productive cave by far was Cave 4, discovered in September 1952. This cave, or rather pair of caves, designated for A and 4B, was artificially cut into the soft marl terrace just meters away from the ruins of an ancient settlement at Qumran. Unlike the natural caves in the cliffs, Cave 4 had been deliberately excavated, probably as a storage facility or hiding place. And it contained an enormous cache of manuscript fragments, thousands upon thousands of pieces representing approximately 500 different texts. The sheer volume of material from Cave 4 created immense challenges. The fragments were often tiny, just a few letters visible on a scrap of leather or papyrus. Many scrolls had disintegrated into hundreds of separate pieces, creating jigsaw puzzles of extraordinary complexity. The fragments had to be sorted, cleaned, stabilized, photographed, and painstakingly reassembled. It was like reconstructing a library after an explosion, with hundreds of books blown into fragments and mixed together, and no catalog or titles to guide the reconstruction. Among the Cave 4 finds were multiple copies of many biblical books. 9 or 10 copies of Jubilees, a work that retold biblical history with additional legendary material. 21 phylacteries, tefillin, small leather boxes containing biblical verses that Jewish men traditionally bind to their foreheads and arms during prayer. 7 mezuzot, small scrolls placed in door frames. And fragments of the Damascus document, a text partially known from medieval copies found in a Cairo synagogue but now revealed in its older forms from Qumran. Caves 5 and 6, found shortly after Cave 4, produce smaller collections of fragments. Cave 7 was unusual in that its documents were written entirely in Greek, including portions of the letter of Jeremiah and possibly fragments of New Testament books, though this identification remains controversial. Caves 8, 9, and 10 yielded only small amounts of material, but each contributed to the growing picture of what this collection represented. Cave 11, discovered in 1956, was the last of the major finds and proved to be as rich as Cave 1. It contained 21 manuscripts, including some of the longest and most complete scrolls in the entire collection. The Temple Scroll, at over 28 feet in length, was the longest of all the Dead Sea Scrolls. Much of it consisted of instructions for building and maintaining the Jerusalem Temple, presented as divine commands given directly by God. The Psalm scroll from Cave 11 contained not only canonical psalms from the Hebrew Bible but also additional psalms not found in the standard biblical collection. Cave 11 also yielded a fascinating text focused on the figure of Melchizedek, the mysterious priest-king mentioned briefly in Genesis who blessed Abraham. This scroll portrayed Melchizedek as a heavenly figure who would appear in the end times to execute judgment and bring salvation. It was a window into how Jewish interpreters of this period could develop elaborate theological ideas around relatively minor biblical figures. As these caves were systematically explored and their contents documented, a clearer picture emerged of the community associated with these texts. About a quarter-mile from most of the caves stood the ruins of an ancient settlement, known in Arabic as Khirbet Qumran. Archaeological excavations of this site, conducted primarily by Roland de Vos between 1951 and 1956, revealed a complex of buildings that had been occupied during the same general period as the scrolls were written and deposited. The settlement at Qumran consisted of several structures organized around a central courtyard. There were rooms for assembly, a large dining hall, a pantry with hundreds of dishes stacked neatly on shelves, kitchens with ovens and fireplaces, storage rooms, and a system of channels and cisterns for collecting and storing precious water. One room contained 2 inkwells and plastered surfaces that might have served as writing tables, leading De Vos to identify it as a scriptorium where scrolls could have been copied. The site also featured an extensive system of ritual baths, mikvarot, far more than would be needed for simple hygiene. This suggested a community intensely concerned with ritual purity, one that practiced frequent ceremonial bathing as part of their religious observance. There was a cemetery with over 1,000 graves, the bodies oriented north-south unlike typical Jewish burials, and buried in individual graves rather than family tombs. The connection between the scrolls in the caves and the settlement at Qumran seemed obvious to De Vos and most scholars. This appeared to be a Jewish religious community that had lived in isolation at Qumran, maintained an extensive library of religious texts, and hidden those texts in nearby caves when danger threatened. The most widely accepted theory identified this community with the Essenes, a Jewish sect described by ancient writers like Josephus, Philo, and Pliny the Elder. The Essenes, according to these ancient sources, were one of several major Jewish groups in the late Second Temple period, along with the Pharisees and Sadducees. They lived communally, sharing property and resources. They were known for their strict interpretation of Jewish law, their emphasis on ritual purity, their practice of frequent ritual bathing, their rejection of slavery and violence, and their devotion to studying scripture. Pliny the Elder, writing after 70 CE, specifically mentioned a group of Essenes living on the western shore of the Dead Sea, away from the mainstream of Jewish society. The rule of the community, one of the scrolls from Cave 1, seemed to confirm this identification. It described a community structure remarkably similar to what Josephus said about the Essenes. New members went through a lengthy initiation process. Property was held in common. There were ranks within the community. Strict discipline was maintained. The community saw itself as the true Israel, preparing for the end times, living in the desert as Isaiah had commanded, making straight in the wilderness a way for the Lord. Yet the community these scrolls revealed was not peaceful and withdrawn in every way. The war scroll described in vivid detail a coming apocalyptic battle between the Sons of Light, the community and their angelic allies, and the Sons of Darkness, the forces of evil led by Belial. The battle formations were described with military precision. The scroll envisioned the community emerging from the desert to fight alongside God's angels in the final cosmic war that would establish God's kingdom forever. The scrolls painted a picture of a community intensely focused on remaining pure in an impure world, on studying scripture to understand God's will, on preparing for the rapidly approaching end of the age. They believed they were living in the final generation before God's intervention in history. They interpreted current events as fulfillments of ancient prophecies. They saw themselves as participants in a cosmic drama that would soon reach its climax. The teacher of righteousness, mentioned in several texts, appeared to be the founder or early leader of this community. he was described as someone to whom God had revealed the true meaning of the prophet's words. He had been persecuted by enemies, including a figure called the wicked priest, often identified with one of the Hasmonean high priests who ruled Judea in the 2nd and 1st centuries BCE. The teacher had led his followers into the wilderness, establishing a new covenant community there. But the teacher of righteousness had died, and the scrolls seemed to expect his return, or at least the coming of a messianic figure or figures who would fulfill his mission. Some scrolls spoke of two messiahs, a priestly messiah from the line of Aaron and a kingly messiah from the line of David, who would together restore Israel and establish God's rule. Other texts spoke of a prophet like Moses who would arise in the last days. The calendar used by the community was different from the lunar calendar used in the Jerusalem temple. The Qumran community followed a solar calendar of 364 days, with each quarter of the year containing exactly 13 weeks. This meant that feast days always fell on the same day of the week year after year. It also meant that the community's festivals didn't coincide with the temple festivals. From the community's perspective, the temple authorities were observing the sacred days on the wrong dates, adding to the list of ways the Jerusalem establishment had corrupted true worship. The purity laws observed by the community were stricter than those required by the Torah. Members practiced celibacy, at least while living at Qumran, though this remains debated. They ate communal meals with ritual significance. They devoted hours each day to prayer and study. They copied scriptures and composed new works interpreting those scriptures for their times. They lived a highly regulated life, every hour accounted for, every action governed by the community's rules. Yet this isolated community, this small group living in the desert awaiting the end of days, left behind a legacy far beyond what they could have imagined. Their library, hidden in caves as danger approached, preserved not just their own sectarian writings but copies of biblical books that would prove crucial for understanding the history of the biblical text. Their scrolls would eventually reach scholars around the world, revolutionizing our understanding of ancient Judaism, illuminating the world in which Christianity was born, raising new questions even as they answered old ones. The community at Qumran apparently came to an abrupt end around 68 CE, during the Jewish revolt against Rome. The site shows signs of destruction and burning consistent with a Roman military attack. Josephus records that the Roman 10th Legion moved through the area, suppressing any remaining centers of resistance on their way to besiege the last rebel strongholds. Whether the community members hid their scrolls and fled, whether they were killed defending their settlement, or whether they had already abandoned the site before the Romans arrived, we don't know. But the scrolls remained in their caves, sealed away from light and air and the knowledge of passing centuries, through the fall of Jerusalem, through the Bar Kokhba revolt 60 years later, through the rise and fall of empires, through the coming of Christianity and Islam, through crusades and conquests, through the long centuries when the memory of the community that had produced them faded entirely from human knowledge. The desert kept their secret well, until a Bedouin shepherd's wandering goat and a thrown stone broke the silence at last. To understand fully what made the discovery of these scrolls so momentous, we need to step back and consider what scholars knew about the biblical text before 1947. The Hebrew Bible, what Christians call the Old Testament, had been transmitted through countless generations of Jewish scribes. The standard Hebrew text used by scholars, called the Masoretic text, dated from the early medieval period, roughly the 9th and 10th centuries CE. The oldest complete Hebrew Bible manuscript was the Aleppo Codex from around 920 CE, and the Leningrad Codex from 1008 CE. This meant there was a gap of well over 1,000 years between when the biblical books were originally composed and the oldest complete manuscripts scholars possessed. During that millennium, texts had been copied and recopied by hand, generation after generation. How accurately had the texts been preserved? Had significant changes crept in over the centuries? Were there different versions of biblical books circulating in ancient times? These questions had profound implications not just for biblical scholarship but for faith communities who regarded these texts as sacred scripture. There were some ancient witnesses to the biblical text that predated the medieval Hebrew manuscripts. The Septuagint, a Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible made in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE, provided evidence for what the Hebrew text looked like at that early period, though translation choices sometimes made it difficult to determine precisely what the underlying Hebrew had been. The Samaritan Pentateuch, the version of the first 5 books of the Bible used by the Samaritan community, also attested to an ancient textual tradition, though scholars debated how much weight to give its variations from the standard Jewish text. But actual Hebrew manuscripts from the ancient period were extremely rare. The Nash Papyrus, discovered in Egypt in 1898, contained the 10 Commandments and the Shema prayer from Deuteronomy. It dated to around the 2nd century BCE and was the oldest known fragment of the Hebrew Bible before the Dead Sea Scrolls. Just one small papyrus, a handful of verses, and scholars had to rely on it and on later translations to guess what the ancient Hebrew texts had looked like. The Dead Sea Scrolls changed everything. Suddenly scholars had Hebrew biblical manuscripts that were 1,000 years older than anything previously known. The Great Isaiah Scroll from Cave 1, dated to around 125 BCE, was more than a millennium older than the medieval manuscripts, yet when scholars compared them, they found the text had been transmitted with remarkable fidelity. Yes, there were variations, differences in spelling, an occasional different word choice, but the text was fundamentally the same. This was powerful evidence for the care and skill of the Jewish scribal tradition. Yet the scrolls also revealed that the story was more complex than previously thought. Among the biblical manuscripts from the caves were examples that differed more substantially from the standard Masoretic text. Some scrolls were closer to the version of the Hebrew Bible that must have underlain the Septuagint translation. The Hebrew text behind the Septuagint had long been a scholarly puzzle, now there were actual Hebrew manuscripts that resembled it. Other scrolls were similar to the Samaritan Pentateuch tradition. Still others represented unique textual forms not matching any known tradition. What this meant was that during the late Second Temple period, multiple forms of the biblical text coexisted. There wasn't yet a single standardized version that everyone used. Different communities, different scribal schools, possessed slightly different versions of the sacred texts. It was only after the destruction of the temple in 70 CE, as the rabbis worked to consolidate and preserve Judaism in the wake of that catastrophe, that a standard text was gradually established, the text that would become the Masoretic tradition. The scrolls also shed light on which books were considered scripture during this period. The biblical texts found at Qumran included copies of every book of the Hebrew Bible except Esther. But the absence of Esther might not be significant. It's a short book, and its possible scrolls of Esther were simply not found or didn't survive. More interesting was the presence of multiple copies of books that didn't make it into the later Jewish or Protestant biblical canons. Jubilees, Enoch, Tobit, Sirach, and other works were copied and preserved alongside texts like Genesis, Psalms, and Isaiah, suggesting these works held significant authority for the community. This opened up questions about how the biblical canon was formed. The process by which certain books came to be regarded as scripture while others were excluded was clearly still ongoing during the period when the scrolls were written. The lines between biblical and non-biblical, between canonical and apocryphal, were not yet firmly drawn. Different Jewish communities might have had somewhat different collections of sacred texts. The non-biblical scrolls provided even more fascinating insights into the religious world of late Second Temple Judaism. The sectarian writings from Qumran revealed a community with its own rich theological tradition, its own interpretive methods, its own spiritual practices. Reading these texts, scholars could see how Jewish interpreters of this period approached scripture, how they understood prophecy, how they made sense of their own experiences in light of ancient texts. The Pesher commentaries, for example, showed a fascinating interpretive approach. A pesher would quote a biblical passage and then provide an interpretation that applied it directly to the community's own time. The prophecy of Habakkuk, written centuries earlier about Babylonian invasions, was reinterpreted to refer to Roman armies and to conflicts between the community and the Jerusalem priesthood. This wasn't seen as reading things into the text, rather, the community believed God had revealed to their teacher of righteousness the true, hidden meaning of the prophetic words, the meaning that had been there all along waiting to be understood. This interpretive method would be familiar to anyone who has read the New Testament. The Gospel writers frequently quote Hebrew Bible passages and interpret them as prophesied of Jesus. Matthew's Gospel in particular often says something happened to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet. The technique of reading ancient texts as speaking directly to present events, of finding contemporary significance in ancient prophecies, was clearly a widespread approach in Jewish biblical interpretation of this period. The Community Rule and Damascus document provided detailed pictures of how sectarian Jewish communities organized themselves. There were hierarchies and ranks. There were rules for every aspect of life, from waking to sleeping, from eating to studying, from working to worshipping. Discipline was strict. Those who violated the community's regulations faced penalties ranging from reduced food rations to temporary or permanent expulsion. The community's possessions were held in common, with members surrendering their property to the group's collective ownership. New members underwent a lengthy initiation process that could last years. They had to demonstrate their understanding of the community's teachings, their commitment to its strict way of life. They were examined and approved by community leaders before being allowed to participate fully in the communal meals and rituals. The process bore some resemblance to monastic initiation rites in later Christian traditions, and scholars have wondered whether early Christian monasticism might have drawn on models from Jewish sectarian communities. The War Scroll painted a dramatic picture of the community's eschatological expectations. The scroll described in elaborate detail the final war between good and evil. The Sons of Light, the faithful community and their angelic allies, would battle the Sons of Darkness, the forces of wickedness led by Belial and his demons. The battle would unfold in stages over 40 years. There would be victories and setbacks. But ultimately, with God's intervention and the help of the mighty angel Michael, the forces of light would triumph, evil would be destroyed, and God's eternal reign of righteousness would be established. The military formations described in the War Scroll were remarkably detailed and showed knowledge of contemporary Roman military tactics. The community, despite living in isolation and studying scripture, clearly paid attention to the world around them. They saw themselves not just as spiritual warriors but as preparing for actual combat in the final apocalyptic battle. The scroll described the weapons to be used, the battle standards to be carried, the trumpet signals to direct troop movements, even the prayers to be said before and during combat. This apocalyptic worldview, this sense of living in the final days before God's dramatic intervention, pervaded many of the sectarian scrolls. The community believed they were the last generation, that the prophecies were being fulfilled in their own time, that the end was imminent. They weren't just preserving ancient traditions, they were actively preparing for the climax of history, positioning themselves to play a crucial role in the cosmic drama that would soon unfold. The Thanksgiving hymns, Hodiot, provided a more personal window into the community's spirituality. These prayers and psalms expressed deep religious feeling, a powerful sense of human smallness and divine greatness. The speakers in these hymns acknowledged their own sinfulness and weakness, their utter dependence on God's grace and mercy. Yet they also expressed joy in being chosen, in being part of God's covenant community, in possessing knowledge of divine mysteries hidden from the wicked. Some of the hymns seemed to be written in the voice of the teacher of righteousness himself, describing his persecution, his calling to lead the community, his special revelations from God. He was portrayed as a suffering righteous figure whose pain and rejection paradoxically confirmed his divine commission. Scholars have noted parallels with the suffering servant figure in Isaiah 53, and have wondered whether this tradition of the righteous teacher who suffers unjustly might have influenced early Christian understandings of Jesus' death. The scrolls also provided new information about Jewish beliefs in angels and demons during this period. Angelic figures appeared frequently in the texts. Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, and other named angels played active roles in the cosmic drama. There were angels assigned to different nations, angels who interceded for humans, angels who would fight alongside the sons of light in the final battle. The scrolls even described the heavenly liturgy, the songs the angels sang before God's throne, hymns that the earthly community joined in their own worship. Demons and evil spirits also featured prominently. Belial, the chief evil angel, led the forces of darkness. Various demons afflicted humans with disease and tempted them to sin. There were prayers and incantations for warding off demonic attack. This rich angelology and demonology showed how Jewish thought of this period was developing complex hierarchies of spiritual beings, ideas that would later influence both Christian and Islamic theology. The community's calendar reforms revealed deep theological convictions about time itself. By following a solar calendar of 364 days rather than the lunar calendar used in Jerusalem, the community was making a statement about cosmic order. The solar calendar divided the year into 4 equal seasons of exactly 13 weeks each, 91 days per quarter. This meant the calendar never changed, feast days always fell on the same day of the week. The spring new year always fell on a Wednesday, the 4th day of creation, when God made the sun and moon to mark times and seasons. The community believed this calendar, which they claimed had been revealed to Enoch and other ancient patriarchs, reflected the true divine ordering of time. The lunar calendar used in the temple, they believed, was a corruption, one more sign of how far the Jerusalem priesthood had strayed from true worship. By following what they saw as God's eternal calendar, the community was aligning themselves with cosmic order, with the rhythms of creation itself, with the calendar observed by the angels in heaven. This calendar dispute might seem like a technical matter, but it had profound practical implications. It meant the community celebrated Passover on a different day than the Jerusalem temple, observed the Day of Atonement on a different date, marked the Festival of Weeks at a different time. From the community's perspective, they were keeping the feasts when God commanded, while the rest of Israel was observing sacred days at the wrong times, rendering their worship invalid. From the perspective of the Jerusalem authorities and most Jews, the Qumran community was the one out of step, presuming to know better than the hereditary priesthood how God's calendar should be reckoned. The purity laws observed by the community were similarly strict and separatist. The Hebrew Bible contains numerous rules about ritual purity and impurity, describing conditions that make a person temporarily unfit to participate in worship or enter sacred space. These include contact with corpses, certain bodily discharges, specific diseases, and various other circumstances. The Torah prescribes purification rituals, mainly involving washing and waiting, to restore purity after becoming ritually impure. The Qumran community took these purity laws and intensified them. They developed extensive additional regulations, covering cases not explicitly addressed in Scripture, specifying precise procedures for purification, defining exactly what counted as impurity and what didn't. The numerous ritual baths at the Qumran site testified to how central purity concerns were to daily life. Members bathed frequently, before communal meals, before prayer, before studying Scripture, after any potential contact with impurity. This intense focus on purity wasn't just about following rules. It reflected a worldview in which holiness, separation from contamination, was paramount. The community saw themselves as a living temple, a holy priesthood, even as the Jerusalem temple still stood. They were maintaining the kind of purity that would normally be required only of priests serving in the sanctuary. By living in this state of constant ritual purity, they were claiming for the entire community the kind of holiness previously associated only with the priesthood. The communal meals at Qumran appear to have had special significance, possibly seen as foreshadowing the messianic banquet of the end times. The Damascus document described how the community would eat bread together when the Messiah came, carefully maintaining order and hierarchy even at the messianic feast. This ritualized community meal, involving bread and likely also wine, where members gathered in purity and holiness, has obvious parallels to the Christian Eucharist, though scholars debate whether there was any direct influence. The community's attitude toward the Jerusalem temple was complex and somewhat contradictory. On one hand, they clearly disapproved of how the temple was currently being run. They believed the priestly families controlling the temple were illegitimate, perhaps because they weren't from the correct priestly line, or because they had gained power through political maneuvering rather than divine appointment. They thought the temple calendar was wrong, the purity regulations insufficiently strict, the interpretation of God's commands too lax. Yet at the same time, many of the scrolls showed deep reverence for the temple as an institution. The temple scroll presented elaborate, divinely ordained instructions for building and maintaining the sanctuary. The community clearly longed for a purified, properly run temple. Some scrolls suggested the community saw themselves as preserving true priestly traditions that would be restored when God intervened to cleanse the temple and establish righteous leadership. This tension, between rejection of the current temple establishment and reverence for the ideal of the temple, helped explain the community's physical and spiritual position. They had withdrawn to the wilderness, separating themselves from corrupt institutions. Yet they hadn't simply given up on the temple. They were waiting, preparing, studying, maintaining themselves in purity, ready for the day when God would restore true worship and they could return in triumph to serve in a cleansed and properly functioning sanctuary. The scrolls also contained wisdom literature, texts offering practical and philosophical advice for living a good life. These texts used the traditional forms of Hebrew wisdom writing, collections of proverbs and instructions, but often added the community's particular theological emphases. True wisdom came from studying God's law. The wise person was the one who understood God's mysteries, who could interpret the signs of the times, who lived according to the community's strict standards. There were also more esoteric texts, describing visions of the heavenly temple, recounting the throne chariot vision from the book of Ezekiel, exploring mystical traditions that would later develop into fuller Jewish mysticism. These texts revealed that the community wasn't solely focused on legal interpretation and ritual observance. They also cultivated visionary experiences, contemplation of divine mysteries, mystical ascent to heavenly realms. In their isolation in the desert, studying scripture day and night, maintaining constant purity, they believed they could achieve communion with the divine, could participate in the angelic worship before God's throne. The sheer diversity of texts in the Qumran library is striking. Alongside biblical books and sectarian community rules, there were astronomical texts, calendrical calculations, lists of priestly courses, collections of blessings and curses, liturgical works for various occasions, wisdom instructions, apocalyptic visions, rewritten biblical narratives that expanded and embellished the stories in Genesis or Exodus, collections of biblical prophecies arranged thematically, and much more. This diversity tells us something important about the community. They were sophisticated intellectuals engaged with a wide range of texts and traditions. They studied astronomy and mathematics to perfect their calendar. They knew scripture intimately, could quote it from memory, wove biblical phrases into their own compositions. They were heirs to ancient wisdom traditions, apocalyptic speculation, mystical practices. They were creative interpreters and authors, not just preserving old texts but producing new ones, developing new interpretations, expressing their distinctive theology in diverse literary forms. The scrolls also preserved multiple copies of previously known works like Jubilees, Enoch, Tobit, and Sirach. Before the Dead Sea Scrolls, These books were known primarily from later translations into Greek, Latin, Ethiopic, or other languages. The discovery of Hebrew and Aramaic copies at Qumran confirmed that these works originated in Jewish circles and were regarded as authoritative by at least some Jewish groups, even though they didn't ultimately become part of the standardized Hebrew Bible canon. The Book of Enoch, portions of which were found in Aramaic at Qumran, was particularly significant. This work claimed to record the visions and journeys of Enoch, the mysterious figure from Genesis who walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. The book described Enoch's travels through the heavens, his visions of angels and demons, his knowledge of the heavenly calendar, his prophesied about coming judgment. The book had been preserved in full only in Ethiopic translation and was used as scripture by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. Finding Aramaic fragments at Qumran confirmed its Jewish origins and its importance to at least some Jewish groups in antiquity. Similarly, the Book of Jubilees, which retold the stories of Genesis and Exodus with additional legendary material and with a strong emphasis on the solar calendar and strict law observance, was found in numerous copies at Qumran. This suggested it held particular importance for the community, perhaps because its theological emphases aligned well with their own views. The books claim to reveal the true, eternal calendar received by Moses on Mount Sinai would have resonated with a community that saw calendar reform as central to true worship. As scholars worked to piece together information from the scrolls about the community that produced them, they tried to correlate this evidence with what ancient historical sources said about Jewish groups of the period. Josephus, Philo, and Pliny the Elder all mentioned the Essenes. Josephus provided the most detail, describing Essene beliefs and practices at some length in his histories. Many of the details matched what the scrolls revealed about the Qumran community: communal ownership of property, strict discipline, elaborate initiation procedures, concern for ritual purity, belief in predestination, expectation of immortality for the righteous. Pliny the Elder, writing shortly after 70 CE, specifically mentioned a group of Essenes living on the western shore of the Dead Sea above or away from the unhealthy waters, with the town of En-Gedi below them. This geographical reference seemed to fit the Qumran site perfectly. The pieces of the puzzle appeared to align. The community described in the scrolls, the ruins at Qumran, and the Essenes described by ancient writers seemed to be the same group. Yet some scholars raised questions about this identification. The scrolls themselves never used the name Essene. They referred to themselves as the Yahad, the community or union, or as the Sons of Light, or simply as Israel. Could there have been multiple sectarian groups with similar practices? Were the Essenes a broad movement encompassing various subgroups, of which the Qumran community was one? Or was the equation of Qumran with the Essenes too simple, ignoring significant differences? Alternative theories proposed that the scrolls came from Jerusalem, perhaps from temple or synagogue libraries hidden during the Jewish revolt. This would explain the diversity of texts and the presence of multiple textual traditions. But it struggled to account for the sectarian documents, the community rules that clearly described a separatist group living apart from mainstream Jewish society. Another theory suggested the community was actually aligned with the Sadducees rather than the Essenes, pointing to certain legal positions in some scrolls that matched what rabbinic sources attributed to Sadducees. But this theory also had difficulties accounting for aspects of the scrolls that didn't match what was known about the Sadducees. Most scholars continued to accept some form of the Essene identification, while acknowledging that the picture was undoubtedly more complex than early simplistic equations suggested. Perhaps Essene was a broad category that encompassed various subgroups with somewhat different practices and beliefs. Perhaps the Qumran community represented a particularly strict or separatist branch of a wider Essene movement. Or perhaps the labels applied by ancient Greek and Roman writers didn't map precisely onto the self-understanding and categories used by the Jewish groups themselves. Whatever the exact identity of the community, the scrolls they left behind opened an unprecedented window into the diversity and richness of Jewish religious life in the late Second Temple period. This was an era of tremendous creativity and ferment, when multiple Jewish groups were developing distinctive interpretations of their ancestral traditions, when apocalyptic expectations ran high, when the pressures of foreign rule and cultural change sparked both resistance and adaptation. It was into this world that Jesus was born and early Christianity emerged. The Dead Sea Scrolls don't mention Jesus or John the Baptist or any Christian figures, but they illuminate the Jewish context in which Christianity arose. The apocalyptic worldview, the expectation of imminent divine intervention, the interpretation of Scripture as speaking to present events, the development of sectarian communities with their own distinctive practices, the emphasis on purity and righteousness, all these features visible in the scrolls help us understand the religious atmosphere of first-century Palestine. Some early scholars, eager to find Christian connections, proposed that the teacher of righteousness was John the Baptist, or that the wicked priest represented those who opposed Jesus, or even that the scrolls were somehow Christian documents. These theories have been thoroughly rejected. The scrolls are Jewish documents from a Jewish community, written before Christianity existed as a distinct religion. But understanding the Jewish sectarian movements of this period, the variety of ways Jews interpreted their traditions and organized their communities, helps us see Christianity in its original context as one of several Jewish renewal movements arising in response to the political and religious challenges of the time. The physical process of preserving the scrolls in the caves also raises fascinating questions. The pottery jars in which many scrolls were stored were specially manufactured, their shapes and sizes designed to hold rolls of parchment or leather. Someone had carefully wrapped scrolls in linen before placing them in the jars. Lids were fitted to seal the jars. Then the jars were carried to caves and carefully positioned. This was a deliberate act of preservation, not haphazard hiding in panic. Why would the community take such care to preserve their library? They could have simply fled with the scrolls, or buried them near their settlement, or destroyed them to prevent capture. Instead, they distributed them among multiple caves, particularly the natural caves higher in the cliffs, caves that would be difficult to access and unlikely to be searched. They were thinking not just about immediate safety but about long-term preservation. Perhaps they believed they would return after danger passed. Perhaps they hoped faithful Jews of a future generation would discover them. Or perhaps, driven by their apocalyptic worldview, they believed God would preserve these texts for the righteous remnant that would survive the coming tribulation. The fact that the scrolls survived at all is remarkable. The climate of the Judean Desert, with its extreme dryness and minimal rainfall, was crucial. In most environments, organic materials like leather and papyrus decay rapidly. Moisture, insects, bacteria, and mold destroy such materials within years or decades at most. But in the sealed caves near the Dead Sea, protected from rain, in an environment with humidity often below 15%, wrapped in linen and sealed in jars, the scrolls could survive not just decades or centuries but 2 millennia. Even so, the ravages of time were evident. Many scrolls had disintegrated into fragments. The linen wrappings had decayed. Some pottery jars had cracked, exposing their contents to greater environmental stress. Scrolls that had been stored without jars, or whose jars had broken, suffered worse damage. The leather and papyrus became brittle. Some scrolls fused together or to their linen wrappings, making them impossible to unroll without destruction. Ink faded or flaked off. In some cases, only tiny fragments survived, preserving just a few letters or words from what had once been complete texts. The work of conserving and studying these damaged materials would prove to be a monumental challenge, one that would occupy scholars for decades. But that work revealed not just the content of the scrolls but also information about how they were made, who wrote them, when they were written, and how they deteriorated. Scientific analysis would eventually extract data the original authors never imagined their writings would yield. The discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls in 1947 came at a pivotal moment in history. The Second World War had just ended. The Holocaust had devastated European Jewry. The question of whether a Jewish state would be established in Palestine was about to be decided by the United Nations and then by war. The scrolls seemed to speak to this moment, ancient voices from the Jewish past emerging just as the Jewish people were reconstituting themselves in their ancient homeland after centuries of diaspora. For Jewish scholars like Eliezer Sukenik, the scrolls held special significance. Here was physical evidence of Jewish religious and intellectual life in the land of Israel 2,000 years ago, of Jewish communities copying and preserving and interpreting the texts that would become the Hebrew Bible, of distinctively Jewish theological and legal traditions. The scrolls connected modern Jews to their ancestors, bridged the gulf of 2 millennia, testified to continuity and survival. For Christian scholars, the scrolls illuminated the world in which their faith was born. They could read texts that Jesus' contemporaries were reading, see interpretive methods that early Christians would adapt, trace the development of ideas that would influence Christian theology. The scrolls made the 1st century CE more tangible, more vivid, more human. They revealed that the world of early Christianity was even more complex and diverse than previously imagined. For scholars of all backgrounds and faiths, or no faith, the scrolls represented an extraordinary archaeological and historical treasure. They were primary sources for understanding a crucial period in human religious history. They preserved linguistic and literary information about ancient Hebrew and Aramaic. They provided data on scribal practices, ancient book production, textual transmission. They opened up questions that had never been asked before, because scholars had never had such material to work with. The years immediately following the discovery were chaotic. War in Palestine made systematic archaeological work difficult. Fragments of scrolls appeared on the antiquities market, sold by Bedouin who had found them but whose finds hadn't been officially documented. Scholars scrambled to locate additional caves, to acquire and preserve fragments, to begin the slow work of analysis and publication. Political control of the scrolls was split between Israel and Jordan after the 1948 war partitioned the land. The scrolls discovered before 1948 or acquired by Israeli institutions went to Israel. Those in the Rockefeller Museum in East Jerusalem, under Jordanian control, remained there until 1967. The Bedouin continued to search the area for years, finding caves and fragments that archaeologists might have missed. This meant that significant numbers of scroll fragments entered the market through unofficial channels, without proper documentation of their original location and context. Some of these fragments were eventually acquired by institutions and scholars, but the loss of archaeological context made them harder to study and authenticate. In later years, this lack of clear provenance would contribute to problems with forgeries as unscrupulous dealers tried to create fake Dead Sea Scroll fragments to sell to collectors. The size and condition of the manuscript collection from Cave created particular challenges. Thousands of fragments, many smaller than a postage stamp, had to be laid out, examined, grouped by script and parchment type, tentatively identified, and slowly assembled into whatever texts could be reconstructed. DeVos and Harding assembled an international team of scholars for this enormous task. The work was painstaking and slow. Scholars had to become familiar with hundreds of different scribal hands. They had to recognize fragments from the same scroll by matching breaks in the parchment, by observing consistent letter forms, by noting continuities of text. It was like working on thousands of jigsaw puzzles simultaneously, where most of the pieces were missing, where you didn't always know which puzzle a particular piece belonged to, and where the pictures you were trying to recreate were texts in ancient languages that might be previously unknown. Some fragments could be joined to others immediately. Others remained isolated for years until someone noticed a connection. Still others have never been successfully placed. The scholars working on the scrolls came from various countries and religious backgrounds, reflecting the international interest in these discoveries. There were Catholic priests and Protestant ministers, Jewish rabbis and secular scholars, Americans and Europeans, all united by fascination with these ancient texts. They worked in the Palestine Archaeological Museum in East Jerusalem, in a space that became known as the scrollery, where fragments were laid out on tables, where photographs were taken, where scholars hunched over magnifying glasses comparing tiny details of script and parchment. As the scholars worked, they realized that publication of the scrolls would take decades. There were simply too many texts, too many fragments, too much detailed analysis required. A publication series was established, Discoveries in the Judean Desert, which would eventually extend to 40 volumes over more than half a century. The first volume appeared in 1955. The last would not be published until 2009. This slow pace of publication, and the limited access to unpublished materials, would eventually become controversial. Scholars who weren't part of the official editorial team had to wait years or even decades to see many of the texts. Theories and interpretations in published works couldn't be fully evaluated without access to all the relevant material. By the 1980s and early 1990s, pressure was building to speed publication and to open access to the scrolls. But all that lay in the future as the first wave of discoveries was being absorbed. In the early 1950s, the sheer excitement of the finds overshadowed concerns about publication schedules. Scholars were still exploring caves, still finding new texts, still reeling from each new discovery. The Great Isaiah Scroll, the Community Rule, the Habakkuk Commentary, the War Scroll, these major texts from Cave 1 had already revolutionized understanding of ancient Judaism and the biblical text. What would Cave 4, with its enormous cache of fragments, reveal? What secrets still lay hidden in caves yet to be found? Cave 11, discovered in 1956, provided a dramatic answer to that question. Its texts, though fewer in number than Cave 4, included some of the longest and best preserved scrolls in the entire collection. The Temple Scroll offered the most detailed description of an ideal Jerusalem temple found anywhere in ancient Jewish literature, far exceeding what the Hebrew Bible itself provided. The Psalms Scroll showed that collections of psalms existed that included both canonical biblical psalms and additional compositions not found in the later standardized Psalter. The Melchizedek text revealed how a minor biblical figure could be developed into a major actor in end-time drama. With the discoveries from Cave 11, the great age of finding new scroll-bearing caves at Qumran came to an end. Later surveys and excavations in the 1960s, and again in the 1990s and 2000s, would locate a few additional caves and fragments. But the 11 caves found between 1947 and 1956 contained the vast majority of material. The years that followed would be devoted to conservation, analysis, publication, and debate about these extraordinary texts that a shepherd boy had accidentally discovered in the Judean wilderness. As you drift toward sleep tonight, imagine those scrolls resting in their caves through all those centuries. Imagine the hands that carefully copied each letter, the scribes who devoted their lives to preserving and transmitting these texts. Imagine the community members who hid them away, hoping they would survive whatever catastrophe was coming. Imagine the silence of the caves, the slow passage of years becoming decades, becoming centuries, empires rising and falling while the scrolls waited in darkness. And then imagine that moment of rediscovery, that thrown stone breaking the silence, that shepherd peering into the cave and finding something he couldn't have imagined, something that had been waiting there, patient, for 2,000 years. The scrolls that emerged from those caves contained a remarkable variety of texts, a library that opened windows into ancient Jewish thought and practice that scholars had never imagined existed. To understand the full significance of the Dead Sea Scrolls, we need to explore what was actually written on those ancient parchments and papyri, what ideas they preserved, what voices from 2,000 years ago they allow us to hear. Roughly 40% of the scrolls are biblical texts, copies or fragments of books that would eventually become part of the Hebrew Bible. Every book of the Hebrew Bible is represented except Esther, and even that absence might be simply an accident of survival rather than a deliberate exclusion. The biblical scrolls ranged from tiny fragments preserving just a few letters or words, to substantial portions of books, to the remarkable Great Isaiah scroll that contained the entire book in a single beautifully preserved manuscript. The book most represented among the scrolls was Psalms, with 39 different manuscripts identified. This shouldn't surprise us. Psalms were central to Jewish worship and spirituality, prayers and hymns that individuals and communities turned to in times of joy and sorrow, celebration and crisis. The community at Qumran, devoted to constant prayer and study, would naturally have wanted multiple copies of this collection. Deuteronomy appeared in 33 manuscripts, the second most common biblical book among the scrolls. Again, this makes sense. Deuteronomy contains the core of Jewish law, presented as Moses' final speeches before his death and Israel's entry into the Promised Land. It emphasizes exclusive worship of the God of Israel, obedience to divine commandments, and warns of consequences for unfaithfulness. For a community devoted to strict interpretation and observance of God's law, Deuteronomy would be essential reading. Genesis appeared in 24 manuscripts, Isaiah in 22, Exodus in 18, Leviticus in 17. The variety of biblical books represented showed that the community possessed and studied a wide range of scripture, not just selecting favorite texts but engaging with the entire corpus of what would become the Hebrew Bible. But alongside these biblical texts were books that didn't make it into the later Jewish canon. The Book of Enoch appeared in 25 manuscripts, more than any biblical book except Psalms, Deuteronomy, and Isaiah. This showed how important Enoch was to the community. The book claimed to record the patriarch Enoch's visions of heaven and hell, his knowledge of astronomy and the calendar, his prophecies about coming judgment. For the Qumran community, with their emphasis on the solar calendar and apocalyptic expectations, Enoch's writings provided ancient authority for their distinctive beliefs. Jubilees appeared in 21 manuscripts, again showing its significance to the community. This book retold the stories of Genesis and Exodus but with additional details, interpretations, and emphases. It presented a 364-day solar calendar as revealed to Moses. It stressed the eternality and binding nature of certain laws. It portrayed the patriarchs as perfectly observant of commandments that wouldn't officially be given until Sinai. For a community that saw themselves as returning to an original, pure form of covenant faithfulness, Jubilees provided a vision of how the patriarchs had already lived according to the true, eternal law. Tobit appeared in 5 manuscripts, 4 in Aramaic and 1 in Hebrew. This charming story of a righteous Jew in exile, his son's journey, and the angel Raphael who guides them, was preserved in full only in Greek and Latin translations and became part of the Catholic and Orthodox biblical canons. The discovery of Aramaic and Hebrew versions at Qumran proved it originated in Jewish circles and was valued by some Jewish communities, even though it didn't enter the Hebrew Bible. The Wisdom of Sirach, also known as Ecclesiasticus, appeared in several manuscripts. This work, written in Hebrew in the early 2nd century BCE, offered practical advice for wise living, combined traditional wisdom with reflection on Israel's history, and emphasized the connection between wisdom and Torah observance. It was translated into Greek by the author's grandson and became part of the Catholic and Orthodox canons. The Hebrew text had been mostly lost, known only from fragments found in the Cairo Geniza, until the Dead Sea Scrolls produced additional portions. These non-canonical books appearing alongside biblical texts raised important questions about how communities determined which books were scripture. The process of canonization, of deciding which books would be included in the official list of sacred texts and which would be excluded, was clearly still ongoing during the period when the scrolls were written. Different Jewish communities might have had somewhat different collections. The lines between biblical and non-biblical, canonical and apocryphal, weren't yet firmly fixed. The sectarian documents, texts produced by or for the specific community at Qumran, made up about 30% of the scrolls. These included the community rule, which described how the community should organize itself, how new members should be initiated, how discipline should be maintained, how study and worship should be conducted. The document revealed a community with strict hierarchy, where members were ranked by their spiritual progress and understanding. An overseer or guardian supervised the community's affairs. Priests held special authority. Assemblies were conducted with careful attention to order and precedence. The Damascus document, found in multiple copies at Qumran and also known from medieval copies discovered in Cairo, described laws and regulations for communities of the same movement who lived in towns and villages rather than in isolated settlements. These members could marry, own property, participate in ordinary economic life, while still maintaining the movement's distinctive interpretations of Jewish law and its separatist identity. The document showed that the movement wasn't limited to the monastic-style community at Qumran but extended more broadly throughout Jewish society. The War Scroll provided an elaborate description of the final apocalyptic war between the Sons of Light and the Sons of Darkness. The text described military formations with remarkable detail, drawing on knowledge of contemporary Roman military tactics but applying them to an eschatological scenario. There would be battle standards with sacred inscriptions. There would be trumpet signals directing troop movements. There would be waves of attack and counterattack. Priests would encourage the warriors with prayers and declarations of God's support. Angels would fight alongside humans. And ultimately, despite initial setbacks and periods when the Sons of Darkness seemed to prevail, the forces of light would triumph. Belial and his demons would be defeated, and God's eternal kingdom would be established. The thanksgiving hymns, Hodiot, were collections of psalms and prayers expressing profound religious devotion. Many seemed to be written in the voice of a community leader, possibly the teacher of righteousness himself. These hymns spoke of suffering and persecution, of being rejected by former associates, of receiving special revelation from God, of the enormous responsibility of leading God's chosen community. They also expressed deep humility before God's majesty, acknowledgement of human frailty and sinfulness, gratitude for divine mercy and grace, joy in being among the elect who possessed knowledge of God's mysteries. The Pesher commentaries took biblical texts, particularly prophetic books, and provided verse-by-verse interpretations applying them to the community's own time. The Habakkuk commentary, for example, took this short prophetic book written about Babylonian invasions in the 7th century BCE and reinterpreted it as referring to events in the commentator's own time. The invading armies became the Romans or earlier Greek rulers. The righteous person who would live by faith became the teacher of righteousness. Those who rejected the prophet's message became those who rejected the teacher. Every verse was mined for contemporary significance. This interpretive method rested on the assumption that the prophets, when they spoke or wrote, were actually describing events far in their own future, events in the end times which the present generation was experiencing. The original historical context of the prophetic books was acknowledged but seen as secondary to their true, hidden meaning which God was now revealing to the community through inspired interpretation. This approach to Scripture would be very familiar to readers of the New Testament, where Old Testament passages are frequently quoted and interpreted as prophesied of Jesus. The Pesher method represented a distinctive hermeneutical approach, a way of reading Scripture that assumed divine intention operated on multiple levels simultaneously. When Habakkuk spoke of invaders from afar, he was describing both the historical Babylonians and, in a deeper sense, the forces threatening Israel in the commentator's own time. Every detail of the prophet's words could be mined for contemporary meaning. Ambiguous phrases could be read as encoded references to specific people or events. The Pesherim weren't forcing meaning onto the text arbitrarily. From the community's perspective, they were uncovering the true meaning that God had planted there from the beginning, waiting to be revealed to those with eyes to see. This conviction that their generation was living in the prophesied end times shaped everything about the community. Their isolation in the wilderness wasn't retreat from the world, it was fulfillment of prophecy. Their strict observance of purity laws wasn't mere punctiliousness, it was preparation for the coming divine intervention. Their conflicts with the Jerusalem priesthood weren't political disputes, they were the predicted persecution of the righteous by the wicked. Living within this interpretive framework gave meaning to suffering, provided assurance that their sacrifices had purpose, confirmed their identity as God's chosen remnant. Other scrolls catalogued the blessings that would come upon the faithful and the curses that awaited the wicked. These weren't just abstract pronouncements but detailed descriptions. The faithful would receive wisdom and understanding, would be protected from evil spirits, would participate in eternal glory with the angels. The wicked would face confusion and darkness, would be delivered to destroying angels, would be cut off from the community of the living. These blessings and curses made concrete the stakes involved in remaining faithful to the covenant. The community's understanding of dualism permeated their texts. They saw reality divided between light and darkness, truth and falsehood, the spirit of righteousness and the spirit of perversity. Each person was influenced by these opposing forces, though God had predetermined how much each spirit would dominate in any given individual. This wasn't quite absolute predestination in the sense that individual choice was meaningless, but it did emphasize that human agency operated within frameworks established by divine will. People were called to align themselves with the spirit of light, to resist the spirit of darkness, but God ultimately controlled the proportions and the final outcome. This dualistic worldview helped explain the existence of evil and suffering. The world was currently under the dominion of Belial, the angel of darkness, who had been given authority for a limited time. Belial commanded demons and wicked spirits who led people astray, inspired violence and injustice, opposed God's purposes. But this was temporary. At the appointed time, God would intervene decisively. Belial and all his forces would be destroyed. The righteous would be vindicated. Evil would be eliminated not gradually through human progress but suddenly through divine judgment. Angels played prominent roles in the scrolls. They were organized in hierarchical orders, with names like Michael and Gabriel heading various angelic hosts. They joined humans in worship, participated in the community's liturgies, would fight alongside the faithful in the final battle. The boundary between earth and heaven was permeable in the community's thought. When the community gathered for worship, they believed angels were present, participating invisibly. When they sang the Sabbath songs, they were joining the angelic choirs before God's throne. This sense of cosmic connection elevated their desert worship to participation in the worship of heaven itself. The scrolls also contained apocalyptic visions describing heavenly realities. The divine throne chariot, Merkava, appeared in several texts, drawing on Ezekiel's famous vision. Multicolored wheels within wheels, creatures with multiple faces, sapphire thrones, the figure of divine glory enthroned above the cherubim. These spectacular images invited contemplation of God's majesty and transcendence. Describing the throne chariot required pushing language to its limits, piling up synonyms and metaphors in attempts to capture something of the overwhelming glory the visionaries claimed to have seen. The community rule provided detailed instructions for communal life that went far beyond what we've already discussed. The document described a rigorous examination process for new members. Someone interested in joining couldn't simply show up and be admitted. They had to first spend time learning the community's interpretation of Torah. Then they appeared before the overseer, who examined their understanding and their sincerity. If approved, they entered a probationary period lasting 2 years. During the first year, the initiate participated in community life but couldn't touch the pure food of the community, couldn't participate in the communal sacred meals, remained separate in important respects. At the end of the year, they were examined again, assessed on their progress in understanding and their adherence to community discipline. If approved, they advanced to the second year, when they could participate more fully but still couldn't share in the community's communal property. Only after 2 full years of probation, after passing a final examination, was the initiate fully admitted as a member. At that point, they contributed all their property to the community treasury. They participated fully in communal meals. They could take part in the council of the community. They were enrolled in the list of members according to their rank. This ranking system meant that members were organized hierarchically based on their spiritual progress, their understanding of the mysteries, their length of membership. When the community assembled, everyone sat in their assigned order. Speaking rights were allocated according to rank. Even the order in which people would be resurrected at the end times was determined by rank. This hierarchical structure prevented chaos but also meant the community was far from egalitarian. Those of higher rank had more authority, more honor, more voice in community decisions. Priests held special status as descendants of Aaron, preserving the covenant of eternal priesthood. The sons of Zadok, the priestly family that the community recognized as legitimate, held the highest priestly rank. Below the priests came the elders, the established senior members. Below them came the Levites. Then came the Israelites, ordinary members ranked according to their spiritual progress. New members entered at the bottom and could advance through faithful study and observance. Discipline was taken seriously. Community members could bring charges against one another for violations of the rule. There were formal procedures for adjudicating disputes, hearing evidence, rendering verdicts. Punishments ranged from minor penalties like reduced rations for a period of time, to temporary expulsion from communal meals, to permanent expulsion from the community in cases of serious transgression. The document listed specific violations and their corresponding penalties with great precision. Speaking angrily against a priest might result in 1 year of penance. Insulting a fellow member might mean 6 months to a year of reduced status. Falling asleep during a community assembly could result in 30 days of penalty. These detailed disciplinary codes showed a community deeply concerned with maintaining order and purity. Every aspect of behavior was regulated. Even small matters like spitting in the assembly or laughing foolishly were subject to penalty. The community saw itself as a temple of human beings, a sanctuary of holiness in place of the polluted Jerusalem temple. Just as the physical temple required meticulous purity to maintain God's presence, so the human temple of the community required constant vigilance against pollution. Communal meals held special significance, described as sacred gatherings requiring ritual purity. Before eating, members performed ritual washing. The meal began with blessings pronounced by a priest. Bread and new wine, probably unfermented grape juice, featured prominently. These communal meals anticipated the messianic banquet, the great feast that would celebrate the arrival of God's kingdom. An intriguing text described the protocol for this future messianic meal. The Messiah of Israel would be present, but the high priest, the Messiah of Aaron, would take precedence. The priest would bless the bread first, then the Messiah, then the others in order of rank. Even in the anticipated age of redemption, the community's hierarchical ordering and priestly primacy would be maintained. This expectation of 2 messiahs, one priestly and one royal, distinguished the Qumran community from other Jewish groups and from later Christian theology with its single messiah. The community believed that God would send both a priestly anointed one from Aaron's line and a royal anointed one from David's line. The priestly Messiah would restore true temple worship. The royal Messiah would defeat Israel's enemies and establish righteous governance. Both were necessary for the complete redemption the community anticipated. The priest would have spiritual authority, the king would have political and military authority, and together they would usher in the age of divine blessing. Some texts hinted at a possible third messianic figure, a prophet like Moses who would arise at the end of days to teach the people and interpret Torah authoritatively. This prophet might have been identified with the teacher of righteousness, or might have been an expected future figure. The texts weren't entirely clear. What was clear was that the community's messianic hopes were complex and multifaceted, resisting simple categorization. The scrolls revealed extensive speculation about the end times. Calculations attempted to determine when the final age would begin. References to specific numbers of years, symbolic periods, jubilee cycles, all seemed to point toward particular dates. Of course, these dates came and passed without the expected divine intervention. But this didn't necessarily shake the community's faith. Prophetic timetables could be reinterpreted, recalculated. Perhaps errors had been made in understanding. Perhaps God had extended the period of testing. The community adjusted their expectations and continued watching for signs. Signs of the end times were detailed in various texts. There would be wars, natural disasters, apostasy among the people, persecution of the righteous. The temple would be polluted, its priesthood corrupted. False teachers would arise, leading people astray with smooth words and deceptive interpretations. But these were birth pangs, necessary preludes to the new age. The worse things seemed, the closer the redemption must be. This framework allowed the community to interpret every hardship as confirmation of their prophetic understanding rather than as contradiction of it. The War Scrolls' description of the final battle was elaborate and vivid. The text described battle formations with 7 ranks of soldiers. There would be cavalry and infantry, slingers and archers. Trumpets would signal different phases of battle: trumpets of alarm, trumpets of pursuit, trumpets of return, trumpets of ambush. Standards bearing inscriptions would mark different units. The truth of God would be written on the standard of the community. The hand of God would mark units dedicated to particular battle functions. The glory of God would be inscribed on the standard carried when the warriors advanced. Priests would participate in battle but wouldn't personally fight. They would stand behind the lines, encouraging the warriors with prayers and sacred words, blowing trumpets to signal divine support. Levites would sound the horns that directed troop movements. The warriors themselves would be selected for strength and courage, would be spiritually pure, would be completely dedicated to God's cause. Anyone with physical defects, ritual impurity, or spiritual wavering would be excluded. This was holy war in the most literal sense, requiring the same purity as temple service. The battle would proceed in stages, with initial setbacks testing the faith of the righteous. 3 times the sons of light would seem about to prevail. 3 times the sons of darkness would rally and push them back. This back and forth would continue until the 7th engagement, when God would finally intervene decisively. Divine fire would consume the enemy. Belial and all his spirits would be destroyed forever. The angels of holiness would rejoice. The righteous would sing hymns of victory. And then the new age would begin, an eternity of peace and blessing. This war theology reflected the community's sense of being embattled, surrounded by enemies both human and demonic. The Jerusalem priesthood opposed them. The Pharisees opposed them. The Romans ruled the land with pagan authority. Evil spirits assaulted them constantly. Only God's direct intervention could rectify this situation. Human effort alone couldn't achieve the redemption they sought. But when God acted, victory would be swift and total. All opposition would crumble. The righteous would inherit the earth, or rather, a renewed earth purified of all corruption. The Temple Scroll was the longest of all the Dead Sea Scrolls, over 28 feet when fully unrolled. It presented itself as direct divine speech, with God speaking in the first person giving commands for building and maintaining the Jerusalem temple. Much of it expanded on instructions found in Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy, but providing far more detail. the dimensions and layout of the temple courts, the precise locations of various chambers and installations, the schedule of sacrifices, the qualifications and duties of priests, all were spelled out with meticulous care. The scroll also included laws not found in the biblical texts, or presented laws from different biblical books in a harmonized form, resolving apparent contradictions or filling in gaps. It described a temple larger and more elaborate than the one actually standing in Jerusalem during the period when the scroll was written. Whether this represented a hoped-for future temple, an idealized vision of what the temple should be, or instructions for renovating the existing temple, scholars continue to debate. The temple scroll's vision of the sanctuary was geometrically precise and symbolically rich. 3 concentric square courts surrounded the temple building itself. The innermost court was for priests only, where the altar of sacrifice stood and where the daily rituals were performed. The middle court was for Israelite men who were ritually pure. The outer court allowed women and children who were pure, but excluded Gentiles and anyone in a state of ritual impurity. Beyond these courts lay the city of the temple, which had special holiness requiring higher standards of purity than ordinary cities. The scroll specified dimensions with exactitude. The inner court measured 280 by 280 cubits. The middle court measured 480 by 480 cubits. The outer court measured 1,600 by 1,600 cubits. These numbers weren't arbitrary. They reflected sophisticated mathematical ratios and symbolism. 7 was a number of completeness and divine perfection. The inner court's dimensions could be understood as 40 times 7. The middle court as 12 times 40. The numbers encoded meaning, connected the earthly temple to celestial patterns, expressed in architecture the structure of reality itself. Within these courts, the scroll described numerous chambers and installations. There were chambers for storing priestly garments, kept separate from the garments worn during sacrificial service to prevent any mixing of sacred and ordinary. There were chambers for storing the showbread, the 12 loaves placed before God each week and then eaten by the priests. There were chambers for preparing offerings, for storing wood for the altar, for keeping unblemished animals designated for sacrifice. Every function required its designated space, every space had to maintain appropriate purity, every detail mattered. The sacrificial calendar outlined in the temple scroll was more elaborate than the one in the Pentateuch. Additional festivals appeared, particularly celebrations connected with the agricultural cycle. The Feast of New Wine occurred 50 days after Passover, marking the time when wine was offered at the temple. The Feast of New Oil came 50 days after that, celebrating the oil harvest. The Feast of Wood Offering had special days when different tribes brought wood for the altar. These additions showed the community's desire to sanctify the entire agricultural year, to connect every harvest and every product to temple worship and divine blessing. The scroll's regulations for purity were extraordinarily strict. Anyone who had experienced a bodily emission had to bathe and wait until evening, then couldn't enter the temple city for 3 days. Anyone who had touched a corpse couldn't enter for 7 days, despite being technically pure after 3 days according to Torah. The blind and deaf were excluded entirely, not because of moral failing but because they couldn't fully perceive the temple's holiness and might inadvertently commit violations. These regulations went beyond biblical requirements, reflecting the community's conviction that the temple required even higher standards of purity than generally practiced. Laws regarding the king appeared in the temple scroll with interesting modifications of Deuteronomy's instructions. The king must be an Israelite, never a foreigner. He must write for himself a copy of Torah and study it constantly. He must not accumulate excessive wives, must not accumulate excessive wealth, must not turn his heart away from God. The scroll specified that the king could marry only one wife during her lifetime, and only after her death could he take another. This monogamy requirement was remarkable in a culture where polygamy was accepted and even expected for kings. It reflected the community's rigorous approach to sexual morality and perhaps also their criticism of the Hasmonean kings who had taken multiple wives. The king's guard was to number 12,000 men, drawn from the tribes of Israel, who would be with him constantly. These weren't just military protection but witnesses to ensure the king didn't violate God's laws. The scroll envisioned a king whose power was constrained by divine law, who ruled in submission to priestly authority, who embodied righteousness rather than exercising arbitrary power. This ideal king contrasted sharply with both the Hasmonean rulers and the Roman-appointed Judean dynasty, neither of which met the community's standards for legitimate kingship. The community's interpretation of Jewish law, halakha, was preserved in various texts. The famous MMT document, Miksat Mares HaTorah, or Some Observances of the Law, presented a series of legal opinions on matters of ritual purity, marriage law, and other issues. The document appeared to be addressed to a rival authority, perhaps the high priest in Jerusalem, explaining why the community maintained different positions on these legal questions. The disagreements often hinged on how strictly purity laws should be applied, with the community generally taking stricter positions than their opponents. These legal disputes might seem arcane, but they reflected fundamental differences in religious worldview. Questions about whether liquids could transmit impurity, about which kinds of skins could be used for writing scripture, about whether Gentile sacrifices could be accepted, about marriage rules for priests. These weren't just technical details. They involved understandings of holiness, of boundaries between sacred and profane, of how to maintain purity in a world full of contamination, of who belonged to the covenant community and who didn't. The scrolls also contained collections of blessings and curses, liturgical texts for various occasions, prayers for different times of day, hymns, and psalms for worship. The songs of the Sabbath sacrifice described the angelic worship before God's throne in heaven, providing words for humans on earth to join that celestial liturgy. The text painted vivid pictures of the heavenly temple with its angelic priests, its divine throne chariot, its hymns of praise. Reading or singing these songs, the community could participate imaginatively in the worship of heaven, blurring the boundary between earth and the divine realm. Astronomical and calendrical texts demonstrated the community's interest in understanding the movements of celestial bodies and computing the proper times for festivals and rituals. The 364-day solar calendar was precisely described, with elaborate calculations showing how it aligned with the cycles of the sun and moon. Lists showed which priestly families would serve in the temple at which times according to this calendar. The community's investment in these calculations reflected their conviction that observing festivals at the divinely ordained times was essential to acceptable worship. Wisdom texts offered practical and spiritual guidance. Some used traditional forms, collections of proverbs and instructions. Others were more extended compositions, lengthy poems about the nature of wisdom, its origin in God, its role in creation, its revelation to those who seek it. Wisdom and Torah were often equated or closely linked. True wisdom meant understanding and living according to God's commandments as revealed in Scripture and as interpreted by the community's teachers. There were also texts harder to classify, works that might have been copied by the community without necessarily representing their own theological positions. These included rewritten biblical narratives that expanded and embellished stories from Genesis or Exodus, collections of biblical prophecies arranged thematically, anthologies of poems or prayers, fragments of lost literary works. The diversity of material suggested a community deeply engaged with their received textual traditions, studying them from every angle, copying and preserving everything they found valuable. One of the most enigmatic texts was the Copper Scroll from Cave 3. Unlike all other scrolls written on leather or papyrus, this was engraved on thin sheets of copper that had been riveted together to form a scroll. The Hebrew text listed 64 locations where treasure had supposedly been hidden, massive quantities of gold and silver, far more than any individual or single community could have possessed. The locations were described with what seemed to be specific geographic references, but efforts to locate these sites have all failed. Was the copper scroll a genuine treasure inventory, perhaps recording temple treasure hidden during the Jewish revolt? Was it a literary work, a kind of ancient treasure map adventure story not meant to be taken literally? Was it written in some kind of code, with the apparent geographic references actually concealing other meanings? The debate continues. The scroll remains one of the Dead Sea texts that resist easy interpretation, a reminder that ancient documents don't always yield their secrets readily. Among the most precious of all the scrolls was the Great Isaiah Scroll from Cave 1. Measuring 24 feet long and standing 10 inches high, it was the largest and best preserved of all the biblical manuscripts from Qumran. The entire book of Isaiah, all 66 chapters, was there in a single scroll, copied in beautiful Hebrew script around 125 BCE. This made it about 1,000 years older than the oldest previously known complete Isaiah manuscript. Isaiah was a particularly important book for the Qumran community and for early Christianity. Isaiah contained powerful visions of a coming age of peace and righteousness, when a righteous king from David's line would rule, when the nations would stream to Jerusalem to learn God's ways, when swords would be beaten into plowshares and spears into pruning hooks. It also contained the suffering servant passages, describing a righteous figure who would suffer unjustly, bearing others' sins, through whose wounds healing would come. These passages would become central to Christian understandings of Jesus' death. For the Qumran community, Isaiah was a prophetic text speaking directly to their time. The community's founder, the teacher of righteousness, was seen as a fulfillment of Isaiah's prophecies about God's servant who would bring true knowledge. The Habakkuk commentary specifically stated that God had made known to the teacher of righteousness all the mysteries of the prophet's words. Isaiah's calls to make straight in the wilderness a way for the Lord were interpreted as commands for the community to withdraw to the desert to study Torah and prepare for God's intervention. When scholars compared the Great Isaiah Scroll to later medieval Hebrew manuscripts, they were amazed at how similar they were. Yes, there were differences. The scroll had numerous variations in spelling, often using fuller, more phonetic spellings than became standard later. There were occasional different word choices, alternative grammatical forms, a few verses that read slightly differently. But the text was recognizably the same. Whole chapters were virtually identical word for word to versions more than 1,000 years younger. This was powerful evidence for the accuracy of the Jewish scribal tradition. The meticulous care with which Jewish scribes copied the Torah and the prophets, checking and rechecking their work, counting letters to ensure nothing was added or omitted, had indeed preserved the text with remarkable fidelity through countless generations of copying. The fear that centuries of hand copying might have introduced major changes or corruptions was largely alleviated. Yet the scrolls also revealed that the story was more complex. Not all biblical texts from Qumran matched the standard Masoretic tradition so closely. Some manuscripts of books like Exodus or Samuel showed substantial differences, including passages present in one version but absent in another, or the same material arranged in a different order. This suggested that during the Second Temple period, before the text became completely standardized, there was more fluidity, more variation among different copies and different textual traditions. The existence of these variant traditions opened up new questions and new lines of inquiry. Scholars could now see how the biblical text developed, how different manuscript families diverged and then sometimes converged, how editors and scribes made choices about how to resolve difficulties or harmonize apparent contradictions. The biblical text appeared not as a static, unchanging entity that dropped from heaven in perfect form, but as a living tradition, carefully preserved yet also subtly developing through the centuries of its transmission. The process of conserving the scrolls presented enormous challenges. As soon as the scrolls were removed from the sealed environment of the caves and exposed to air, light, humidity, and handling, they began to deteriorate more rapidly. The leather and papyrus were brittle after 2,000 years. The ink was sometimes flaking off. Scrolls that had been tightly rolled for centuries couldn't be unrolled without the parchment cracking and pieces breaking off. Some scrolls had fused to their linen wrappings or to each other. Early efforts at conservation, though well-intentioned, sometimes caused damage. Adhesive tape applied to join fragments or seal cracks would later prove difficult to remove and cause staining and deterioration. Fragments stored in humid environments developed mold. Exposure to bright light faded the ink and weakened the parchment. As modern conservation science developed more sophisticated methods, later generations of conservators had to undo some of the damage caused by earlier attempts to preserve the scrolls. By the 1990s, the Israel Antiquities Authority had established a dedicated conservation laboratory focused solely on preserving the Dead Sea Scrolls. Temperature and humidity were carefully controlled. Fragments were stored in specially designed acid-free containers. Conservation work was done under controlled lighting conditions. Chemicals that might cause long-term damage were avoided. The goal was to stabilize the fragments, prevent further deterioration, and ensure these precious documents could survive for future generations to study. Scientific analysis of the scrolls revealed information the ancient scribes never intended to preserve. Radiocarbon dating of small samples of parchment or linen confirmed the dates suggested by paleographic analysis of the script styles, generally placing most scrolls between 200 BCE and 100 CE. DNA analysis of the parchment could sometimes determine what species of animal the leather came from: sheep, goat, gazelle, or other species. This could help match fragments from the same scroll, since pieces from the same animal skin would share DNA. Multispectral imaging used different wavelengths of light to photograph the scrolls. Infrared photography in particular could sometimes make faded text visible that human eyes or ordinary photography couldn't detect. Computer analysis could enhance images, sharpen faded letters, even suggest what missing letters in damaged areas might have been based on patterns in surrounding text. These technologies meant that even badly damaged fragments could sometimes be read, revealing text that seemed lost forever. Study of the ink revealed that it was mostly made from carbon black, likely soot from olive oil lamps mixed with a binding agent. A few texts used red ink made from cinnabar, mercury sulfide, probably to highlight section divisions or important passages. Analysis of the parchment and papyrus could sometimes determine where the materials came from, matching mineral content in the material to water sources in different regions. All this scientific work built up a comprehensive picture not just of what the scrolls said but of how they were made, when they were written, how they were used, and how they survived. The scrolls became subjects of archaeological and scientific study as well as historical and theological analysis. Every aspect of these documents, from the preparation of the writing surface to the choice of words to the methods of preservation, could yield information about the ancient world. The physical process of creating the scrolls was itself illuminating. Scribes worked with enormous care and skill. They prepared the parchment by scraping and treating animal skins until they were thin, smooth, and suitable for writing. They ruled faint lines to keep their script straight, visible still on many fragments. They mixed ink from precise recipes, achieving deep black that would remain legible for millennia. They cut reeds or hollow stems to make pens, trimming them to achieve the right width and flexibility for their script style. Different scribes had distinctive hands, ways of forming letters that were as individual as modern handwriting. Paleographers, scholars who study ancient writing, could often identify which scribe had copied a particular text, could recognize the same hand in different manuscripts, could date texts by comparing scripts to dated examples from other sources like contracts or letters. The Great Isaiah Scroll, for instance, was written in a beautiful, formal hand characteristic of professional scribes in the 2nd century BCE. Other scrolls showed more informal, cursive scripts, possibly written by less skilled copyists or used for texts that weren't considered as sacred. Corrections and erasures in the scrolls revealed the scribal process. When a scribe made an error, omitting a word or writing the wrong letter, they would sometimes scrape away the ink carefully and write the correction over the erasure. Other times they would write the correct text above the line or in the margin and mark where it should be inserted. Some scrolls showed multiple layers of correction, with later readers adding notes or fixing errors they noticed. These corrections weren't failures but evidence of care, of the importance placed on textual accuracy. Some scrolls had notations in the margins, glosses explaining difficult words or providing alternate readings. These marginal notes showed that the scrolls were working documents, studied and annotated by multiple readers over time. The physical manuscripts carried evidence of intellectual engagement, of community members wrestling with meaning, discussing interpretations, preserving alternative understandings alongside the main text. The discovery process for the cave for materials presented unique challenges. Unlike Cave 1, where scrolls had been preserved in clay jars, the cave for texts were found scattered as thousands of fragments mixed together on the cave floor. Centuries of humidity, wind, insects, and possibly ancient disturbances had broken most scrolls into pieces. Scholars faced a puzzle more daunting than any jigsaw, because many pieces were missing, the original images weren't known, and multiple puzzles were mixed together. The initial sorting involved spreading out fragments on large tables and grouping them by physical characteristics, thickness and color of parchment, style of script, column width, content. Fragments that seemed to belong together would be arranged and rearranged, searching for physical joins where broken edges matched perfectly. Sometimes fragments fit together like puzzle pieces. More often, connections had to be determined by textual content, recognizing that two fragments preserved sequential portions of the same composition even though the fragments didn't physically join. This reconstruction work required extraordinary patience and expertise. Scholars needed deep knowledge of Hebrew and Aramaic, familiarity with biblical texts and Jewish literature, understanding of scribal practices and manuscript production, keen visual observation to spot connections, and ability to reconstruct missing text based on context. A single scroll might take years to reassemble, and even then might remain incomplete with gaps where fragments were lost. John Strugnell, one of the original editors assigned to Cave for Materials, described spending days trying to determine whether two tiny fragments belonged to the same manuscript. He would examine fiber patterns, measure letter heights, compare vocabulary and grammar, check whether the fragments could plausibly fit the same column width. Sometimes these investigations confirmed a connection. Other times they proved the fragments came from different scrolls. Either way, the work crept forward slowly, one tiny determination at a time. The Dead Sea Scrolls also illuminated the development of the Hebrew and Aramaic scripts. In the Second Temple period, Jewish scribes were transitioning from the Old Paleo-Hebrew script, the ancient style in which the oldest biblical texts had been written, to the Aramaic square script that would become standard for Hebrew writing. Most of the Dead Sea Scrolls were written in square script, but some biblical texts, particularly copies of Exodus and Leviticus, used Paleo-Hebrew script. Some scrolls mixed the two, writing the main text in square script but using Paleo-Hebrew for God's name, marking it as especially sacred. This practice showed reverence for the divine name, setting it apart visually from ordinary words. The scrolls preserved examples of cryptic scripts, special alphabets used apparently to keep certain texts secret or to mark them as particularly mysterious. These cryptic scripts weren't codes in the modern sense where one systematically substitutes symbols for letters. Rather, they were alternative alphabets, different ways of writing Hebrew where each letter of the normal alphabet had a corresponding sign in the cryptic script. The person who knew the cryptic alphabet could read the text normally, but to those unfamiliar with it, the text would be incomprehensible. Why use cryptic scripts? Perhaps to protect texts from unauthorized eyes, ensuring only initiated community members could read certain materials. Perhaps to mark texts as containing esoteric knowledge, material too sacred or too powerful to be written in ordinary script. perhaps simply as a scribal practice, a specialized skill demonstrating mastery of textual traditions. Whatever the reason, the cryptic scripts added another layer of complexity to the already rich manuscript collection. The scroll's physical format varied. Some were true scrolls, long sheets meant to be rolled. The Great Isaiah Scroll consisted of 17 sheets sewn together, creating a manuscript 24 feet long that would have been rolled from one end to the other as it was read. Other texts were written on single sheets, individual pages that might have been stored folded or stacked. The presence of both formats suggested different uses: scrolls for texts read extensively or liturgically, single sheets perhaps for reference works, correspondence, or texts still being composed or edited. Stitching patterns where sheets were joined together revealed information about manuscript production. Scribes used specific techniques for sewing sheets, particular patterns of thread that could be identified and compared. When fragments from different caves showed the same distinctive stitching technique, it suggested they came from the same scribal workshop or were produced following the same training and traditions. These physical details connected manuscripts to each other and to the broader culture of Jewish literacy and textual production in the Second Temple period. The controversies surrounding the Dead Sea Scrolls extended far beyond academic debates about dating or interpretation. For decades, access to many of the scrolls was restricted to a small international editorial team. This team had been appointed in the early 1950s to work on publishing the huge cache of fragments from Cave 4. They included distinguished scholars from various countries and religious backgrounds, each assigned responsibility for particular texts or groups of texts. But the work progressed slowly. Very slowly. By the 1980s, for decades after the scroll's discovery, the vast majority of Cave 4 material remained unpublished. Scholars outside the editorial team had no access to these texts. They couldn't evaluate theories or interpretations based on unpublished material. They couldn't conduct their own research on these important documents. A situation developed where a handful of scholars effectively controlled access to one of the most significant archaeological discoveries of the century. Critics argued this was unacceptable. The scrolls, they pointed out, belonged to humanity, not to a privileged few. Knowledge about them should be freely shared, not hoarded. The slow publication pace meant that entire scholarly careers could pass without access to crucial material. Important questions about ancient Judaism, about biblical textual history, about the world of early Christianity, remained unanswered because the relevant texts weren't being published. The editorial team defended their approach, noting the enormous complexity of the work, the need for careful analysis before publication, the importance of getting things right rather than rushing to print with incomplete or faulty interpretations. They pointed out that they were working with thousands of tiny fragments, often badly damaged, requiring painstaking reconstruction. They argued that hasty publication of poorly understood material would cause more problems than it solved. But as the years stretched on, and as members of the original editorial team aged and died without having published their assigned materials, pressure mounted for change. In the early 1990s, a series of events broke the monopoly. Researchers at Hebrew Union College used a published concordance to reconstruct some unpublished texts. The Huntington Library in California announced it would provide unrestricted access to its complete photographic archive of the scrolls. Faced with the collapse of their exclusive control, the Israel Antiquities Authority agreed to open access and to appoint a much larger editorial team to speed publication. Emanuel Tuv of Hebrew University was appointed editor-in-chief and immediately set about reorganizing the publication process. The number of scholars working on the texts was increased from fewer than a dozen to around 100. Texts were assigned and reassigned to scholars who would commit to publishing them quickly. Standards for publication were streamlined. By the turn of the millennium, most of the major texts had been published in the Discoveries in the Judean Desert series or in other venues. By 2009, the final volume of that series appeared, completing the official publication of the Dead Sea Scrolls. The scroll publication controversy raised important questions about scholarly access and the ethics of archaeology. Who owns ancient artifacts? Who has the right to study them? How long is reasonable for scholars to work on important materials before making them public? The Dead Sea Scrolls became a test case, and the eventual opening of access set precedents for other archaeological projects. The principle was established that major discoveries should be made publicly available in a reasonable timeframe, that monopolistic control by small groups wasn't acceptable, that the global scholarly community needed access to important materials. Throughout the decades of discovery and study, various controversies and mysteries swirled around the scrolls. Some early sensational claims suggested the scrolls would overturn Christianity, revealing that Jesus' teachings were borrowed from the Essenes, or that John the Baptist and Jesus had been members of the Qumran community, or that the early Christian movement was really just an offshoot of this Jewish sect. These theories were based on superficial similarities and didn't survive serious scrutiny. The scrolls are Jewish documents from a Jewish community. They predate Christianity as a distinct religion. They provide context for understanding the world in which Christianity arose, but they don't mention Christian figures and aren't Christian texts. Other controversies involve the so-called 7Q5 fragment from Cave 7. This cave contained only Greek texts, and one tiny fragment was identified by some scholars as potentially coming from the Gospel of Mark. If true, this would make it the earliest New Testament manuscript by far, and would place a Christian text at Qumran itself. But the identification was hotly debated, with most scholars concluding the fragment was too small to identify with certainty, and that the supposed letter matches with Mark weren't as exact as claimed. The fragment remains unidentified. The Copper Scrolls treasure list generated its share of speculation and even treasure hunting expeditions. Could the treasure really exist? Could it still be found? Various theories propose that it was temple treasure hidden during the Jewish revolt, or Essene community wealth, or perhaps just an ancient equivalent of adventure fiction. Attempts to locate the sites mentioned in the scroll have yielded nothing. If the treasure ever existed, it remains hidden. In more recent years, the appearance of alleged Dead Sea Scroll fragments on the antiquities market raised serious concerns about forgeries. Because genuine fragments commanded high prices from museums and collectors, incentives existed for forgers to create fake scrolls. Several prominent museums, including the Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C., purchased supposed Dead Sea Scroll fragments that were later proven to be modern fakes, probably manufactured in the 2000s or 2010s. This scandal emphasized the importance of provenance, of knowing precisely where archaeological materials came from and having clear documentation of their discovery and custody. The forgery scandal revealed sophisticated techniques being used to create convincing fakes. Forgers would acquire ancient blank parchment or papyrus, perhaps from old documents that had no writing or from blank areas cut from genuine ancient manuscripts. They would mix ink using traditional recipes to match ancient compositions. They would write text in ancient scripts, copying writing styles from published photos of genuine scrolls. They would artificially age the materials, creating the appearance of centuries of deterioration. Only careful scientific analysis, using techniques like radiocarbon dating of the ink itself rather than just the parchment, could definitively prove these were modern creations. The Museum of the Bible case was particularly embarrassing because the museum had invested heavily in acquiring what they believed were genuine Dead Sea Scroll fragments, displaying them prominently, creating exhibits around them. When testing revealed they were fakes, the museum had to remove them, acknowledge publicly they'd been deceived, and face questions about their acquisition practices and authentication procedures. The incident served as a cautionary tale about the antiquities market, the need for rigorous scientific testing, and the dangers of allowing enthusiasm to override careful verification. These modern forgeries, though unfortunate, inadvertently testify to the cultural significance and value of the Dead Sea Scrolls. They mattered enough, meant enough, commanded enough respect and interest, that creating fake scrolls could be a profitable criminal enterprise. The forgeries themselves became subjects of study, as scholars examined what techniques were used, how the forgers operated, what markers could distinguish genuine ancient manuscripts from clever modern imitations. The question of how to properly preserve and present the scrolls for public viewing presented ongoing challenges. The fragments were fragile, light-sensitive, vulnerable to environmental fluctuations. Traditional museum display, with objects constantly exposed in lighted cases, wasn't sustainable for materials as delicate as the scrolls. The Israel Museum developed innovative solutions, displaying fragments for limited periods and then rotating them into storage, controlling light levels carefully, monitoring environmental conditions constantly. Digital displays supplemented the physical fragments, allowing visitors to see high-resolution images without exposing the originals to additional damage. Other museums around the world that hosted Dead Sea Scrolls exhibitions faced similar challenges. Fragments could only travel if strict conditions were met. Climate-controlled transport, limited display duration, careful monitoring throughout the exhibition, all were required. Insurance alone for transporting scrolls was extraordinary, given their irreplaceable value. These practical considerations meant that while many people wanted to see the scrolls, actual public access to the physical artifacts remained necessarily limited. Digital preservation emerged as a crucial strategy not just for access but for conservation. If the physical fragments continued to deteriorate despite best efforts, high-quality digital images could preserve their current state. If fragments became illegible due to fading or damage, images taken earlier might capture text still visible at that time. Multiple imaging technologies applied to the same fragment could preserve different kinds of information: visible light photography for basic appearance, infrared for faded text, ultraviolet for detecting repairs or additions, multispectral for detailed analysis of ink and parchment composition. The Dead Sea Scrolls project represented one of the most comprehensive digital preservation efforts ever attempted for ancient documents. Every fragment was photographed from multiple angles, under various lighting conditions, using different imaging technologies. The resulting digital archive preserved terabytes of data, backed up in multiple locations, ensuring that even if catastrophe destroyed the physical scrolls, the digital record would survive. This wasn't just academic insurance but recognition that these documents belonged to human heritage, that their preservation mattered beyond any single institution or generation. The impact of the Dead Sea Scrolls on biblical scholarship and religious understanding has been profound and continues to unfold. For textual critics, scholars who study how ancient texts were copied and transmitted, the scrolls provided unprecedented data. They could now trace the development of the biblical text through multiple manuscript traditions, could see where variants arose, could understand how scribes dealt with errors or uncertainties in their source texts. The discipline of Old Testament textual criticism was revolutionized by the Dead Sea Scrolls. For historians of ancient Judaism, the scrolls illuminated a period that had been relatively obscure. The diversity of Jewish thought and practice in the Second Temple period became visible in ways it never had been before. The Dead Sea community represented just one strand of this diversity, but their texts showed how creative and varied Jewish religious life could be, how different groups could develop distinctive interpretations of their shared traditions, how sectarian movements arose and sustained themselves. For those interested in the historical Jesus and early Christianity, the scrolls provided crucial context. They showed what kinds of Jewish movements existed in first-century Palestine, what apocalyptic expectations were current, how scripture was being interpreted, how communities organized themselves. Jesus and his earliest followers arose within this Jewish world, and understanding that world better helped scholars understand Christian origins more accurately. For Jewish communities, the scrolls provided tangible connection to ancestors who lived in the land of Israel 2,000 years ago, who copied Torah scrolls and studied prophets and composed prayers and struggled to remain faithful to their covenant with God. For Christian communities, the scrolls illuminated the Jewish roots of their faith, showed the continuity between ancient Israel and early Christianity, demonstrated that Christianity didn't arise in a vacuum but emerged from a rich and varied Jewish religious environment. In the decades since the scrolls' discovery, they have been digitized and made available online. The Israel Museum, in partnership with Google, created high-resolution images of major scrolls and posted them publicly. Anyone with internet access could now examine the Great Isaiah Scroll, zoom in to see individual letters, read translations, and scholarly commentary. What had once been available only to a handful of scholars was now accessible to anyone interested. This democratization of access has allowed new generations of scholars, students, and interested readers to engage with these ancient texts. Digital tools enable searches across the entire corpus, can identify quotes and allusions, can compare different manuscripts. Research that would have taken months or years using printed concordances can now be done in minutes. The scrolls have truly entered the digital age, preserved not just on ancient parchment but in computer databases, secured not just in climate-controlled vaults but in redundant digital archives. The ongoing legacy of the Dead Sea Scrolls extends in multiple directions. New analyses continue as technology advances. Recent work has used artificial intelligence to assist in reconstructing fragmentary texts, training algorithms to recognize script patterns and suggest how damaged letters might have been completed. DNA analysis grows more sophisticated, able to extract information from ever smaller samples. Multispectral imaging techniques improve, revealing text in fragments previously thought too damaged to read. The scrolls also continue to inspire. Writers have created novels imagining the lives of the community members who wrote the scrolls. Films and documentaries have explored the discovery and significance of the scrolls for popular audiences. Museums mount exhibitions where visitors can see actual scroll fragments, learn about the Qumran community, understand the importance of these discoveries. The scrolls have become part of cultural consciousness, symbols of archaeological discovery, connections to an ancient world that suddenly feels more real and tangible. For the land itself, the Qumran site and the caves have become pilgrimage destinations. Visitors can walk through the ruins of the ancient settlement, see the cisterns and ritual baths, look out across the wilderness toward the Dead Sea, imagine what life must have been like for the community that lived there 2,000 years ago. They can hike to some of the caves, peer into the darkness where scrolls once rested, stand in the places where the Bedouin shepherds made their extraordinary discoveries. The site attracts diverse visitors, scholars studying the archaeology, religious pilgrims connecting to ancient faith, tourists interested in famous historical sites, students on educational trips. Walking through Qumran provides tangible connection to the scroll story. The ruins aren't just abstract history but physical spaces where real people lived, worked, prayed, and studied. The caves aren't just archaeological sites but actual hiding places where precious manuscripts waited through centuries until their rediscovery. Standing there, the story becomes immediate and present rather than distant and theoretical. The Dead Sea itself adds to the experience. Its mineral-rich waters, its position at the lowest elevation on Earth, its stark beauty surrounded by desert cliffs, create an environment unlike anywhere else. The climatic conditions that made this region ideal for manuscript preservation, the extreme dryness and stable temperatures, remain evident. Visitors can understand viscerally why materials survived here that would have deteriorated almost anywhere else. The desert's preservation power becomes not an abstract concept but a lived reality. Nearby sites add context. Mar Zayda, the fortress where Jewish rebels made their last stand against Rome, is visible from Qumran. Ein Gedi, the oasis where David hid from King Saul, lies not far away. Jerusalem, the holy city toward which the community oriented their hopes, sits in the hills westward. The geography connects different biblical and historical narratives, showing how the Qumran community existed within a larger landscape of Jewish experience and memory. The story of the Dead Sea Scrolls is ultimately a story about preservation and recovery, about loss and rediscovery, about ancient voices speaking across millennia to those willing to listen. It's a story about the power of writing to transcend time, about the dedication of scribes who carefully copied texts they believed sacred, about a community that valued their library enough to hide it away carefully when danger threatened, about the remarkable accident that led to its discovery, about generations of scholars who devoted their lives to understanding and sharing these texts. It's also a story that isn't finished. Fragments still await full publication and analysis. Questions remain about the community's precise identity, about how some texts should be interpreted, about connections between various documents. New technologies may yet reveal text in fragments currently illegible. Other caves or hiding places might conceivably still be found, though this seems increasingly unlikely as the area has been so thoroughly searched. But whether or not new scrolls surface, the ones we have will continue to be studied, debated, reinterpreted by new generations of scholars bringing new questions and new methods. The scrolls have already transformed our understanding of ancient Judaism and the biblical text. They've provided unprecedented insight into the world from which Christianity emerged. They've demonstrated the power of the desert to preserve what seems lost. They've shown how a chance discovery by a shepherd boy can change our understanding of history. As you drift toward sleep, carrying these images of ancient texts and desert caves and patient scholars piecing together fragments, consider the persistence of human effort to preserve and transmit ideas, stories, prayers, and knowledge across generations. Consider how a community in an isolated desert settlement, expecting the end of the world within their lifetimes, nonetheless carefully copied scrolls and hid them for safekeeping, how that act of preservation echoed across 2,000 years until those scrolls could tell their story to a world those ancient scribes could never have imagined. The Dead Sea Scrolls remind us that what seems lost can be found, that voices silenced by time can speak again, that the desert keeps its secrets until the right moment for revelation. They connect us to people who lived so long ago, yet whose words we can still read, whose prayers we can still hear, whose hopes and fears and faith still resonate. The scrolls are a gift from the past, from anonymous scribes whose names we'll never know, from a community whose exact identity remains debated, from the desert that held them safely until a curious shepherd threw a stone into a cave and heard the sound that would echo around the world. If you've enjoyed this journey into the desert, into the caves, into the world of ancient scrolls and the people who wrote and preserved them, please consider liking this video and subscribing to Sleep Orion. Your support helps me create more content exploring the fascinating stories of human history, the remarkable discoveries that change our understanding of the past, the quiet mysteries that await those willing to listen. Until next time, sleep well, and may your dreams carry you to ancient places where secrets wait patiently in darkness, ready to be discovered.